Hi guys, and welcome back to another Halloweeny DIY with Carly from the Apothecary. Now sometimes in crafting you encounter a project that not only taxes your crafty skills but also your patience. This one was for me. I've been I wanted to do it last year with our DIYs we did then, the haunted house and the spell book. However, I kind of ran out of time, so I was determined to make him this year. And this project is Audrey 2 from the Little Shop of Horrors. Now, been thinking about it for a year. I've been working on it for almost 4 weeks now. There's been a lot of frustration, a lot of naughty words, a lot of distraction projects, really quick ones that I could get out the way to stop me getting discouraged. An outrageous spend or two along the way, possibly. Now, I've worked with plaster of Paris before. I did try Audrey with paper mache, but he just wasn't sturdy enough and wouldn't stand up to the weather. So I thought I would use the plaster of Paris this time. It was also really handy that Audrey's head is already kind of balloon shaped. So I just started with one of these big sturdy silver balloons, and I had to get the strong latex ones because when I tried it with a not strong one, the balloon deflated before the project had a chance to dry, and my Audrey 1 attempt turned out quite wrinkly as everything collapsed as the balloon did. So I started just by drawing his mouth on with a Sharpie. And here I made my first big mistake. It did say on the bag that for every 100 grams of plaster of Paris mix that you should use 75 mils of water. I might have made this one a little too watery. Important lesson number 2 was learned here, which is only make as enough plaster of Paris as you need or that you can use in about 5 minutes, because it will start thickening up really quickly. I had intended on using the gauze and coating that, but as it seemed to be going on quite thick, I very stupidly decided that I would just actually paint it onto the balloon, and hopefully that would be hard enough or thick enough. Pop that aside overnight. As you can see, I didn't do his mouth bit, saved me having to cut bits out later, and I just popped him hanging up to dry overnight. And the next day, I realized my next big mistake. He was so flimsy that he was just cracking apart in my hands. And as I didn't want to get too messy, as last time the plaster of Paris did dry out my hands for weeks, I decided now that I was most definitely going to reinforce him using that gauze. I quickly realized just how messy this project is after about 4 pieces of gauze, and I was just dipping that straight into the mixture and then popping them on and following all the way around him. But after a few pieces and a very messy counter, I decided to take him over to the sink. I did make it thicker around his lip section. Not only does this give him the bumpy lips, but it also reinforces that entrance section. And then I wanted to add his teeth in now, so I just cut some of that gauze into triangles and pop them in now while he's drying. 24 hours later, and he was much sturdier, and I figured I'd try cheat a little bit and speed up my process by adding some green paint into the plaster of Paris mix, and then just giving him a quick coat with another plaster of Paris mixture just to try and sturdy him up a bit more. But unfortunately, the white of the plaster of Paris just made it into a lime green, so I'm probably gonna have to give him another coat. Another 24 hours later and he is dry, and I wanted to give the lines that are on top of his head, so I just roughly drew them in, and then with my glue gun I just followed all those lines and gave it like a spider web effect in between the lines. Luckily, the hot glue only takes about 5 minutes to dry, so I didn't have to wait another 24 hours for the fun bit, which is popping the balloon and watching it shrivel up and seeing how well he stands up now he doesn't have the support of the balloon. Well, he actually seemed to be holding up quite well, but as I was not sure if my paint would adhere to the hot glue, I did decide to add another layer just over the hot glue sections. But as I'd run out of gauze, I just used tissue paper for this. I guess it worked. I'm sure there could have been a better way to do it, but the tissue paper was also thin enough that it went inside those grooves and didn't hide any of the definition that I wanted by doing the lines in the first place. I didn't go all the way to the back of his head with the hot glue lines, as those will be covered up by the foliage that is behind him. I actually wanted to keep that surface as flat as possible, so there was nothing getting in the way of the hot glue adhering to him in the end when I do actually stick the leaves on. Now for his first coat of paint, I wanted it to be quite bright, so I just went in with this neon green, and gave him a quick coat, being sure to get inside all of those grooves and not on his lips, just the bits that I want to be green. This paint was really quite watery and seemed to be taking ages to dry, so I made my next big mistake, which was leaving him to dry somewhere where the kids would be playing. And my rambunctious, boisterous little man came down on Audrey too and knocked one of his teeth out. Now, this was annoying. However, it gave me the chance to realize that I hadn't actually worked out how I was going to paint the inside of Audrey's mouth with all those teeth in the way. So I just trimmed that off. I will replace it when I'm done. Now, I didn't bring all my paints with me today, but I do have this thing of directions, non-permanent hair dye, and a sponge. So as I am going to be putting a tulle in his mouth or chiffon in his mouth with some lights, I didn't need the mouth to be completely perfect, as you're not going to see it. I just didn't want it to be completely white. So I just used this directions hair dye and a sponge and gave him a quick coat inside. While that dries, it was time to give him some definition to his top. I did actually do both sides separately. So I had this darker green watercolor, and I'm just going to mix that with some of that neon green. And then again with my sponge, I just lightly dabbed that over his entire top of his head, not pushing too hard in between the areas, as I don't want to completely cover the lime green. I did go over this a few more times with different shades of green just to give him more texture, some darker shades, and then of course painted his lips red. Now, I don't seem to have filmed this bit, but I did also add some little blood droplets with the hot glue gun over his lips, and I will paint those in red as well. For those, because I hadn't covered it with paper mache, I did use an oil paint red, as I figured that would stick to the hot glue better. Turns out that was right. Though it did take longer to dry than the watercolors, so I had to be patient and leave him overnight again. We'll likely have to go in with another coat of the red. As you can see, I missed quite a few little bits, but I'm going to let it dry first. So now for the leaves, and I had this bunch of fern leaves that I'm going to use. I just don't like the shade of the green. I don't think it goes well with Audrey. So I just mixed some of that dark paint up again, same kind of mix that I used to go over his head. And again, using my sponge, just gave all those leaves a quick coat. And then with that neon green, I decided to do the very tips of each of the separate leaves just to make them pop a little more. We'll initially have him in our conservatory for the Halloween party, but he will be going outside at 6 o'clock once our Halloween party is over and we're going trick-or-treating. So, as I'm so impatient, while those leaves were drying, I decided to get an idea of how he is going to look when he's finished. I have this maroon tulle chiffon lacy stuff, and I have the orange lights. So I'm just going to pop them in there and then using a pokey thing, poke through the tulle. And then into the darkest room in the house to go see what he looks like. He isn't quite finished yet, but I really like the effect. Of course, then I realized my next mistake was I had no idea how I was going to attach the stem or what I was going to use for the stem so that he sticks up out of the plant pot that I'm going to put him in. Needed something sturdy enough to hold up his head and long enough for him to stick out of the plant pot. So I realized that I had that tube from the tool and it's really quite thick and should be the perfect size. So I just worked out where I wanted it to go on Audrey so he was in the right position, and I also had to find a flat enough area that it would stick. So once I did, I just used a lot of hot glue. I'm talking like 3 hot glue sticks to initially glue him in place, making sure to hold it in place initially until that first layer of hot glue had completely dried so that he adhered to it properly, because the tool roll is actually quite heavy and kept trying to fall over. I did add about 4 layers on top, waiting for them to dry in between. Even went up the tool roll a bit to make it a bit sturdier. I even poured hot glue into the center of the tube to hopefully help that stick at the bottom, as I did want it as well stuck as possible. And then once that had dried, it was back to the plaster Paris and the gauze sheets, and I'm going to wrap them all around and adhere it to the bottom. I did go quite far down onto his head to help it secure it, as the head is actually quite heavy. And then with what was left in the bowl, just using my fingers, went all over. It had got quite thick at this point, so that was perfect, and just went round all of those edges and all the way up the pole, just smoothing everything out. Once he was dry, it was time to paint that stem again and cover up any of those areas where the messy plaster of Paris dripped down. So again, I'm just going in with my different shades of green, and I just used my sponge and painted in all of that stem and the bits where I dripped everywhere. I did need to pop him aside to dry for another 20 minutes or so before I started attaching the leaves, as I did want the paint to be completely dry so that the hot glue would actually adhere to it. Then it was time to get an idea of how I wanted my leaves to go. They did have the little plastic bits where they attach to the wire. I cut them off as the flat surface would be easier to adhere to our Audrey. I want the leaves to overlap each other as they go down, I suppose, so it was easier to start with his head section first, or his crown. I wanted it to be bigger at the top, so I used my little leaves first and worked my way up to the bigger leaves, just going around his head and hot gluing those in place. I then just worked my way down the stem, sticking alternating leaves on either side until the entire stem was covered on the back, and then just added 2 more on the front to cover those bits up, or cover the unevenness up. I did use the much bigger leaves going up the stem, as I do want them to hang out of the plant part. I also considered making him some arms, but I think I like him just the way he is. So once I got the effect that I wanted with the leaves up the stem, it was time for some finishing touches. I did have to sacrifice one of the skeletons for this, but it was worth it. We have many more. So I just decided to glue one of his legs and one of his arms hanging out of Audrey's mouth. Then it was time to add back in those lights and the tool and have a look at our finished project. Now I'm quite likely to add a couple of extra layers of paint on his lips and stuff before the actual night, and I'm also going to spray him with that finishing lacquer so that he has more chance of standing up to the British weather. But I am so chuffed with how he turned out. It was a long journey, but I'm really glad I stuck with it and I finished him, and he's going to look awesome on the night. Thank you guys for joining me on this painful journey, painful mission. I hope you liked the video. Let us know if you give this a go, if you learn from any of my mistakes. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you do like the video, and we'll have more videos coming up soon. Bye.